Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, RC Northern California, for having me. Thank you for letting me reschedule, and I do apologize about that. It's been a doozy of a year. I think it's only going to get more exciting for us all. So let's jump into, I think, which is something that is a very pertinent topic for all of us. Collapse studies, how collapse works. You know, I watched a Mad Max movie on a plane recently, and collapse is not everything laid to waste in a desert. It's usually not, where people have to fight each other to the death. It's usually a systems collapse that takes centuries, and rebuilding is happening throughout the process. So that's very much what my work is. If I were to encapsulate it for you all, I would say that this work is, how do you understand the Bronze Age collapse socially through the examination of coffins? Coffins being social documents par excellence. Each coffin represents one person, male or female, all of their spending abilities, all of their religious beliefs, all of their material, what they were able to acquire, what they weren't, the concept of reuse. And so those coffin studies ended up being extraordinarily useful in terms of understanding how ancient Egypt moved from what we call the New Kingdom into what we call the Third Intermediate Period. So we set the stage for those of you who are not as familiar with the chronology, where the Bronze Age collapse finds itself. And I know there are people talking about whether or not Egyptologists should use these terms, Bronze Age or Iron Age, at all. I'm not one of them. I think it helps us to situate ourselves regionally with other parts of the world. And so we're gonna situate ourselves at the end of the New Kingdom, really in the 20th to the 21st, and into a little bit of the 22nd dynasties. Now, the scene is set with the Sea Peoples' invasions and migrations, and there are many others who can talk about this at length, and I'm just going to show you a map and say things were hard, times were difficult. There were many crises underfoot during the 19th and 20th dynasties and into the 21st. And much of what we will be discussing today will be those Sea Peoples. And you know, I've talked with Jason Silvestri about this concept of Libyans, the Libu and the Meshwesh, being being Sea Peoples originally, the Libu settling as early as the 18th dynasty, and the Meshwesh in the 19th. But they are part of these Sea Peoples' migrations and movements, but we Egyptologists and the Egyptians themselves separate them out in an interesting way, that those people who settled in Libya they have a different separate identity, and you might mash a bunch of Sea Peoples together in some documents, but the Libyans are often separated out, and that will indeed be a topic of discussion here today. Now, when these Sea Peoples come into Egypt, we know that they first invaded in some more formal fashion during the reign of Merneptah. Certainly they were already moving in around that time in the 19th dynasty, though not as formal invasions. And then we hear that in the reign of Ramses III, we have another set of formal invasions of peoples who are creating coalitions of Sea Peoples and Libyans, however you want to understand that. And then these people coming into Egypt and being repelled, we are told. But this repulsion takes the place of settling tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, or themselves settling into these migrant camps that become cities of their own in the Delta and in other places, and people moving in and throughout Egypt and becoming a part of this cosmopolitan, complex Egyptian society at the end of the New Kingdom, which is such an interesting topic in and of itself. Now, one interesting image from Karnak Temple, and I did another talk about this at RC last year about Ramses IX and his connection with the high priest of Amun and his connection with the Theban rulers in particular. And we'll come back to Ramses IX because it is interesting that his body is one of the few that was retained by the high priest of Amun of the 21st and early 22nd dynasties. and put into the cache Direl-Bahri 320, which is the subject of the discussion today. So it's interesting to see Ramses IX on the left and the high priest of Amen on the right. You might see this flipped because it is a mirrored image in the Karnak north-south corridor. And you see that the king and high priest are of the same size. And we are entering a time period when the king is not, he's still the good god, he's still a god king, but the king is not of the level and stature that he had been before, certainly not by the end of the 20th dynasty. This is a kingship that is diminished. And I would argue that this is what the book of Exodus is about. It's about the Mediterranean and Levantine region trying to figure out and internalize and understand what it means to have the superpower of the Mediterranean region thus diminished, so that even their kings are at a parity with other mortals like high priests of Amen. Now, it is at this time that certain materials become very, very hard to get. And I have on the left a sycamore fig, sycomore with an O, a ficus tree that is native to Egypt, North Africa, other parts of West Asia. And on the right, I have the Cedrus libani, which I believe this photo is from the Carnarvon Castle grounds in England. If it seems like it doesn't look like it's in the Lebanon, that's why. But these trees were hard to get to. The cedar, because the trade routes had shut down. Any of you who know your tale of Wen Amen know how difficult it was for Wen Amen to get the cedar. He didn't have enough money. They turn him away. The pirates take all his money. The pirates are connected to the Sea Peoples. A rip-roaring tale that I would invite you all to read again. And then as for the sycamore fig or acacia or any other native wood that is used for funerary arts, for furniture making and other things, it seems that the stands of trees that may have been in the Delta or other places, because that's where such stands of trees, if you're going to cultivate them, would grow best. At least that's what we learned from Roman times, that those were commandeered for military functions, or that these sycamore and acacia trees were burned down, that crops could have been burned down, and entire orchards of, would you call it an orchard? Let's call it a stand of such a tree is lost. And it seems that from my perspective as a coffin examiner, coffin researcher, this is a key feature, that people can't get the wood. And what kind of people? Elite people who are used to being able to acquire this wood, to maintain its cultivation and then source it, or to go to a place where they can trade for it and bring it into Egypt. This is compromise. And this is going to affect much of the story as we go forward. Now, even though the wood coming into Egypt or being grown in Egypt is compromised, this doesn't mean that elites in Egypt don't want to show their elite power. There is still great need and great desire to have a grand funeral that makes sure that an elite family is shown in the best light, such that an elite family can give out bread and beer at a funeral, show the grand coffins of their patriarch as they put them into the tomb, can show a big display of wealth and power. It's an interesting thing that even when the material resources to create such a display are dwindling or gone entirely at this time period of late Bronze Age collapse, the elites in question, particularly in Thebes, do not give up the desire to have these kinds of coffin displays of the dead, transfers of wealth from one generation to another. And we'll talk more about that in one moment. And if you want to know more about how I understand coffin making as an element of social competition, you can pick up this little Cambridge Elements book that I put together, I think it's like 3 years ago now, with the Cambridge Elements series. And it's a nice little introduction to how coffins can be understood as commodities and how elites use them as such, and as social commodities. Now, as we enter into the 20th dynasty, we enter into a time of scarcity. And during that scarcity, we see many people, rich and poor, resourcing objects, funerary objects that had already been placed in the ground. And one of our best ways of seeing that and understanding that is by looking at the so-called tomb robbery papyri. And this collection of texts, some of them in Liverpool, some of them at the British Museum, they're scattered all over, found in Western Thebes. They document a series of investigations, interrogations that occurred during the reign of Ramses IX, in which men who worked in the West Bank are rounded up, some of them Deir el-Medina workers, some of them other necropolis workmen, necropolis adjacent workmen, policemen, things like that. They're rounded up, they are interrogated by force, and they're asked to name names. They're asked about what happened in a particular tomb. Tombs are entered by a variety of people, including the vizier, vizier's man, the king's butler, the king's man, and other dignitaries, many connected to the high priesthood of Amen. And they inspect different tombs. They're like, oh, this was taken, or that's intact, or this is doing. So there's a lot of discussion about these tomb robbery papyri, and we Egyptologists have taken it as fact that most of the resourcing and recommodification that's happening of the funerary goods in Western Thebes during the 20th and into the 21st dynasty is done by the lower elements of the population. And my work is helping to rebalance that. I'm not the first to have done this. You have to look at the work of Carl Janssen Winkel, Nicholas Reeves, John Taylor, all of whom have excellent research discussing how the high priesthood of Amen, in concert often with northern powers, how do you get a sarcophagus of Merneptah into the tomb of Tanis, for instance? That these men were systematically resourcing the goods placed into the Valley of the Kings and other tombs at Drabal Naga and other places to fund their regimes that did not have access to gold in Nubia, that did not have access to trade with the Lebanon, that was really compromised in terms of bringing in material resources and paying their troops. And it seems that going into these tombs was a vital importance. And thus these tomb robbery papyri is, from my perspective, more of a crackdown on those who would dare to horn in on their operation, rather than a crackdown on robbery outright. I see it in a very different light from other Egyptologists, because of course this is what is there in the Valley of the Kings, or what was there in the Valley of the Kings in the 20th dynasty. You have a collection of generations of fabulous wealth, if Tutankhamun is to be any example thereof. And there's much discussion of this. I know there are some Egyptologists like Peter Lacovaro think that Tutankhamun's tomb was one of the richest in the Valley of the Kings. But others, like Nicholas Reeves, would argue that the tombs of Ramses II or Merneptah were of a much more fabulous nature than the tomb of Tutankhamun. And I would second that latter belief. The idea that Merneptah had 3 or even 4 nesting sarcophagi, and that's Ted Brock's work and putting all of those sarcophagi together. Nesting sarcophagi, how do you even get them to nest with one another? How do you hoist them into place? How do you move it into the tomb? That in and of itself is a defensive strategy to protect something on the inside. I dare say a set of solid gold coffins through and through, but we will never know, because they are gone and the sarcophagi have all been broken up. And Merneptah was reburied in a different piece that was not originally his. But these are the treasures that the kings at the end of the 20th dynasty, their generals, men like Payyank and Herihor, generals who were working for those kings at the end, and then switched allegiances and started working for the high priesthood of Amen, and then themselves became that same high priesthood of Amen. These are the treasures that are funding a set of regimes in conflict with one another and on a downward spiral into a crisis in which social contracts that had been in operation for generations are being ripped up before people's eyes. Does it sound familiar? Feel familiar? I think the social contracts being ripped up, I think, does indeed feel familiar. More information about this is coming out in recent publications, and I I direct you towards an article by Stefan Polis, which is wonderful. He's translated this ostrakhan from the Western Valley. That is Ostrakhan Valley of the Kings 2022. This is a 2023 publication. And we have here a prayer to Amun from a 21st dynasty official asking for help in locating gold and silver. You can't get more exact and direct and on the nose than a text like this, which is wonderful because so much of what's in my book, Recycling for Death, is looking at any 20th dynasty West Theban documentation from the perspective of tomb robbery. Robbery might be too strong a word during a time of crisis. Tomb recommodification, tomb recycling. That's why I call it recycling for death. Because people don't, like, if people are having a difficult time and say they need to steal diapers from the CVS or from someplace, they don't document in their diary, you know, I stole diapers from the CVS today. They just steal the diapers and that's it. It's the same in ancient Egypt at this time. People are only going to write down in the documentation what serves them to have written down. So they don't say, oh, went into the family sepulcher today. This would be like one of the descendants of Khonsu and Senedjim of Theban Tomb 1. Went into the family sepulcher today and took out a nested coffin set to reuse it for X, Y, or Z. They're not going to write that down. They don't need to write it down. It's not in their best interest to write something like that down. So I need to look at, as the researcher, I need to look at the coffins of Theban Tomb 1, or I need to look at other circumstantial evidence of coffins to see if there's reuse. I need to look at what might be in a text that suggests reuse, but doesn't suggest it outright. And I went through, some of you who know my work and have been following the funerary work know that my first book is called The Cost of Death and is about how much coffins cost in the 19th and 20th dynasties. And I note in that book that in the 20th dynasty, most of the texts are for coffin decoration. And very few of the texts with prices are for coffin construction, coffin carpentry, amongst a group of Deir al-Medina workers who are creating what I call an informal workshop. In Recycling for Death, this newest book, I went through those texts again, and I looked at them from the perspective of reuse, because when I wrote that first book, The Cost of Death, I didn't understand the scale of the reuse. I hadn't done that work yet. Now that I've gone through hundreds of coffins and examined them for reuse, I understand now how scarce material resources were and how much recycling was actually occurring. So I went through those price documents and I came to the conclusion, oh my goodness, there are so few carpentry prices because the coffins are already built. The coffins are coming out of the necropolis in whole cloth, if you like. They're being pulled out. And there's all kinds of prices for weird craft techniques that involve scraping or shaping or emptying out or doing other things. And to turn an 18th dynasty coffin into a 19th or 20th dynasty coffin, really is to turn an 18th dynasty into a 20th or 21st dynasty coffin, involves a lot of manipulation. 18th dynasty coffins are bigger. They need to be sized down. And so a lot of what I looked at again in those price and workshop documents helped me to see in a circumstantial way, not direct evidence for the reuse, but circumstantial evidence for the reuse. And that's all in the second chapter of Recycling for Death. Let's move away from this slide and get to another slide. So the kinds of evidence that we do have for reuse and recycling of funerary treasures of individuals at the highest level of society come in the form of dockets. A kind of graffiti, if you like, a graffito that could be put on the cover of a coffin lid. It could be put on the wall of a tomb, but something that documents someone was here, someone did something that involved recycling in some way, but they don't give us the details of what's happening. So let's read how this works. Just one example. Regnal year 6, month 2 of inundation, day 7, we have a date, we're documenting that, very legal, okay, fine. The day when the vizier, the general, and the high priest of Amun-Re, king of the gods, Herihor, issued a dispatch to restore the burial of King Menmot-Re, life, prosperity, health, the son of Re, Seti, beloved of Ptah, by the agent Haramenpanaf and the Cadet Prepayut. And you can look to your Robert Rittner, the Libyan Anarchy book. There's all kinds of wonderful translations in there and get an idea of this. We see here that we see the people involved. They have great power, right? You have a vizier. We don't have a king mentioned, but we have the high priest of Amen, Herihor mentioned. So we know that we're into the very early 21st dynasty at this point. And no Tanite king is mentioned, no Theban or no Ramessid king is mentioned. If one is still standing at this point, is unclear. But we have that there is a need to restore the burial of Men Mot Re. Why do you need to restore a burial unless something has happened, unless he's had his burial goods removed from him, unless he's maybe even had his mummy opened and all of those precious treasures that we know surrounded the body of Tutankhamun must have also surrounded the body of Seti I. He's had those removed from him as well. And there was a need to rebury, re-ossirify, as Nicholas Reeves puts it, recoffin. And so we're doing a keres, a reburial again. There's no other details in here. They're not going to put the details in here like, oh, we got this many pounds of gold from this tomb. It was awesome. You don't put that because you don't want your peers in this time period to know what it is you're pulling out of the tomb. More on that particular point later. But we're dealing with laconic texts that include time, people, place, sometimes place, and the basics of what it is they're doing, but we don't have more information than that. A very interesting thing that they're showing us when they do this is that they're caretaking. They're taking care of Seti I. He needs to be reburied. Something's happened to him. He needs to be re-ossirified. And so the high priest of Amen, the priesthood as a group, and the high priest as Herihor, Payank before him, and then Penejim after Herihor, are coming in and saying, I'm here to caretake for these kings whose tombs have been harmed. They don't say that they themselves may have been the ones who have gone and harmed them, but they're coming in to show that they're able to use their magic, use their prayers, use their skill and initiation as high priests to rebury them in the appropriate way, such that they will not be angry ghosts like we read about in the text Kansu Emhab and the Ghost. Very interesting text that I talked about in the Fesher for Betsy Bryan, if you want to look at that. And I link this in the book Recycling for Death specifically to an idea that burial is about caretaking for the dead and is linked specifically to inheritance of money, goods, property, and all kinds of things. There is a wonderful text published by Janssen and Pessman, Papyrus Bulak 10, Ostracon Petrie 16, as you see here. It's since been renamed. You don't have to worry about that. But it's a text that it pretty much says that the one who buries inherits. If you go through the trouble of bringing in the labor of ritual to re-ossirify, if you go through the trouble to re-coffin, then you inherit the stuff. So it's kind of a workaround, if you will, that the Egyptian religion itself, its funerary religion, all of these rituals have created a workaround such that during a time of crisis, the high priest of Amen can say, we have the initiated knowledge, we have the magic, we have the skills, we need to go in, we need this gold, we need it now. They can go in and they can take it. And as long as they do it properly, in terms of recoffining, they inherit the titles. Herihor calls himself king in the Temple of Khonsu. I'll show you an example in a moment. Penejim does in some contexts as well. They inherit the material wealth. They inherit ownership of the land. They inherit the running of the temple, and so on and so forth. So all of this does indeed seem to be a very human thing, which is not talking about the money directly, but talking about how much you care for the person you're getting the money from. And I'm not saying that everyone is a cynical a-hole who's just pulling money and funds, but I am saying that people do like to veil and to cleanse or launder their inheritance of money by means of caretaking, by means of saying that they're a good descendant of their ancestor, or saying that they're putting their ancestor into the ground or into the tomb in a proper way. So here we have that image of Herihor as king from Khonsu Temple, and you see Thoth on the left and Behdet on the right, and he's being cleansed by both of them. And it's very interesting because he still calls himself High Priest of Amen in the cartouche. So he's trying to kind of have it both ways. He's part of a community that, and I talk about this in other places, where he's very people are very distrustful of kingship at this time. They've been burned by kingship. The authoritarianism has been too much at the end of the 20th dynasty. So he's a king in this ritual context, but he makes sure that even in that cartouche, he presents himself as one of his peers. He's a high priesthood of Amen in context with a community of other priests. And it's important that he does that. It's a little fifth dynasty, if you like, following a time period of extraordinary authoritarianism of the fourth dynasty, where they're building these massive pyramids. Fifth dynasty comes in and they're like, no, we're sun priests, you guys. We need to bring it down a notch and move away from this God king stuff. That's exactly what we have in the 21st dynasty. Penejim I, he's participating in that exact same game, trying to show himself as king by reusing monumental statues of Ramses II and others at Karnak, reusing the small temple at Medinet Habu, but then in other scenes showing himself as a simple priest, not as a king, but the scenes that his peers are going to see in a very close-up scale, he's like, okay, no, here I'm a simple priest. I'm not anything more than that. At this time period, we also see that Egyptians are done with the ad hoc decision-making of great men. It's not working. The social contracts have been ripped up, and we're dealing with communities that are scarred by some of those ad hoc decisions. And there's much more decentralized decision-making, public decision-making, or semi-public, I should at least say, because we have a closed community of high priests of Amen at Thebes. And you'll note all of this is a Theban story. It's where all of our documentation is coming from. I'm telling a story of the Bronze Age collapse from a southern vantage point of much safety and security in comparison to what was going on in Upper Egypt to the north of Thebes, where I know the Berkeley team is working, and then even further beyond that into Saqqara and then the Delta, where things, it seems, were much more ravaged at the 20th and 21st dynasties. But the point is, people all throughout Egypt, but documented at Thebes, are working through religious ritual systems for decision-making. It pushes the responsibility away from any one person. It lets Jesus take the wheel, if you like. It's a little let Amen take the wheel, and I don't need to have this decision on my shoulders. In fact, any one of us can't have this decision on our shoulders, so we're going to let the divinity decide. The oracle is going to be shouldered by dozens of men, and that God is going to be moved around. Maybe they were drunk, maybe they were high, we don't know, but they're taking their directions from a community rather than from one despot, if you want to use a loaded anachronistic term, from above. They're making their decisions in a different way. And now finally we come to the book, and you see that that this book, you see that image on the right of Thutmose III, most of this book are these coffin essays. And I have too many such coffin essays in this book, and I will include as many as I can in the next 30 some minutes, 25 or so that we have left. And let's see how many we're able to look at in terms of, oops, but I have something to say first, apparently. And that something is, it's an interesting thing to note how the kings of the 18th dynasty in particular are revered and set apart by the high priesthood of Amen and considered as divinity ancestors. And I include here from the coffin of Butek Amen, an early 21st dynasty workman from the Valley of the Kings, in the Valley of the Kings, a Deir el-Medina workman. His father was Jehuti Mes, and he is giving offerings to Amenhotep I. And there are many coffins that include Amenhotep I on the backboard, such that when you lay the mummy into the coffin, you are melding, in a sense, with this ancestor king, Amenhotep I. These Deir el-Medina men, and in fact, these high priests as a whole, are taking so much from these 18th dynasty kings in terms of material. They're also taking from them it in a ritual way, and then giving back to them in that typical Egyptian give and take, You give something to me, you give me life and prosperity, I will give to you offerings of bread and beer and all kinds of things that you would give to a divinity in a daily meal, and so on and so forth. And you see this throughout 20th dynasty Dir el-Medina tombs in Hirhau. I dare say that this lineup of kings suggests to me, and I'm going to say something very incendiary, inflammatory, and provocative, and many of your heads will explode when I say this, but I will suggest that the recycling of the Valley of the King's tombs by those at the top started earlier than Ramses VI. And I think a tomb like in Hirhau suggests that very informally, but it suggests a connection to kings in the Western valleys and in the lands of the dead that I find suspicious. I can't prove anything. I can just suggest it to you here and let your heads explode as they will. Here we have the coffin of Bakhemut, with an image of Thutmose III to give you an idea that this king, and we will spend some time on the coffin that he was reburied into, is really the 18th dynasty king par excellence for these high priests of Amen. And they seem to have paraded him around as a means of justifying their power, showing their power, not once, but multiple times. And I'll show you the evidence for that in one moment. Now we come to Dir el-Bahri 320. This is what it looks like. This is an image that Nicholas Brown sent to me. Thank you, Nick. Because I did not climb up to this space and see it myself, wasn't able to do that. But it's probably a reused 18th dynasty queen's tomb of some kind. I'll leave the discussion for whose it is to other people, but it's not an easily accessible place. And this is where we have the high priests of Amen, most of them from Penedjem I on. We don't have Herihor, we don't have Pai Ankh, but they're burying themselves in community with their favored, I argue, their favorite 18th, 19th, and even some 20th, 20th dynasty kings and queens. So they're including themselves in community with those ancestors, those royal ancestors that serve them best politically, socially, in other ways. There are also king's burials from KV 35, the tomb of Amenhotep II. There was probably a cache burial in the tomb of Horemheb, according to Nicholas Reeves, that is not preserved like the cache burial from Amenhotep II. And of course, there's tombs from Dra el-Bolanaga as well. But we'll focus mainly on the Dir el-Bahri 320 cache. And this is just to give you some idea. Dir el-Bahri's, the Hatshepsut Temple of Millions of Years is there, and then Mentuhotep II is just beyond it to the south. And then you have the Dir el-Bahri 320 cliffside tomb there dug into the space. And all of these objects were then pulled out and brought to the museum at Tahrir. And this is me some 10 years ago looking at these objects. And many of the royal coffins have since been moved to Fustat and to the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in a mighty parade that many of you may remember from the pandemic years. Now, when I looked at all of these coffins, I brought with me, and Amber Myers-Wells helped me to do this. She set me up on my iPad with a wonderful program called Notability, in which I was able to keep myself to task. Because when you're looking at a coffin that comes out of a case for just a couple of hours, 3 or 4, maybe 5 at most, and you need to look at all of these different things, it's really important to keep yourself focused and be like, I have to look at this, I have to look at that, I have to look at this other thing, and make sure that you're going down with as much system as you possibly can. So let's get into the weeds now and look at some of the pieces that we have time to look at. And let's start with the coffin of Seqenen Tao. And I'm just working on a piece for the arts journal, an MDPI arts journal. Oh, that's my son coming in. Jules,
what's up?
I'm on a live Zoom.
Hello, everybody.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, that's going on YouTube and everything. Okay, so Seqenen Tao. I was working on an article about the king's coffins, the coffins that were made for kings, specifically for kings, with Nemi's headdresses and other things that are markers of a king's coffin. And here you have one of those, 18th dynasty piece. I would say it's probably later than Seqenen Tao himself, of the 17th dynasty. I think this is an 18th dynasty coffin. You can fight me, but note the kinds of details that I, thanks, Deanna, that's sweet, that I look at on these pieces. So just let's do a close-up here. Let's do a close-up, right? This is how I look at these coffins. First of all, look at the forehead. Do you see that blue underneath the yellow? Right? So there are multiple layers of paint on this piece. That at some point there was blue paint and then maybe a layer of plaster and then a layer of yellow. And I argue that the yellow, whoops, there we go, that this yellow layering that we so often see on these coffins, I'm going to argue in that arts article that will be forthcoming in a couple of months, is trying to reclaim the gold that was taken from the piece. It's a cheap, ritual, magical way of doing it, but it is still giving back the flesh of the gods that was taken. And you can see that the gold was taken. Note, I think, let me go here. Look at the chisel marks that I have arrows going to that show you that the gold was roughly removed from this piece. And you can see here the falcon heads. There is a little bit of gilding left there, but the gold has been roughly chiseled away. There is even evidence. Oh, here, look at, do you see these pinholes here? Pinholes on the seams, tiny little holes that suggest to me that this coffin was once covered with a sheet gold of some kind that you attach with pinholes. That was removed, peeled off, if you like. And then this coffin for second Enre was gilded with a thin layer of gilding, very, very thin. And you do see evidence of it in the collar, if I go back up here, and on the bird on, I think it's a vulture, on the chest, it does have an extraordinarily thin layer of gilding. But this is a typical feint of the 21st dynasty high priest. They'll take off a really significant amount of gold, but then they'll put back something that's going to look nice and glinty and shiny in a ritual that was such that when they show it to their peers, they're like, oh, we didn't take as much as you think we took. Now, I think that this coffin, like Thutmose III's coffin, went through a number it went through a series of recommodifications. It wasn't just hit with a scraping of gold one time, but at least twice. And you can see that when I go to the eyes were removed. We can see that there would have been metal eyes of some kind. Those have been prized away. The uraeus has been removed. And then we have two layers of text. Note that there's an incised text with gilding. And then there's a text that's just in red, right? That goes over that incised text with gilding. So there's a re-inscription of this piece as well. I'd like to point out that so much more work needs to be done on something like this re-inscription. I'm in there taking images, doing something very quick in a time, very quickly in the time that I have in the museum. There are multiple studies that can come out of closer work on these coffins, probably using the photographs, because you're not going to be able to get access to this piece in that dark unlit room in the Nemek where you're not allowed to have photography, right? So use these photos. I'll give you photos if you need them. Just let me know. So this coffin has been opened and unlocked. And if you look at the inside, you've got to open these pieces. And this is where it gets super interesting. And you see that this piece has been opened at least once, closed, and then broken open. You saw through that mortise and tenon, and you take something from the inside, which demands that you're moving the mortise and tenon over to a different part of the width of the case side. You're also using this black varnish that Margaret Serpico writes about, Kate Fulcher writes about, that's made of bitumen that's imported, but also tree resins imported. And you're healing whatever you removed from the inside by putting this black varnish substance on the inside. And notice how the black varnish goes over this unfinished and modified case seam. So that's or lid seam. It's not a case. The case is on the right. Very, very interesting that we have the Egyptians of the 20th and 21st dynasty taking from the king's coffins, maybe then giving back, re-gilding, and maybe even letting the king have multiple pieces in a set, like maybe two pieces in a set. And then there's an institutional memory, a cultural memory that something has been reburied, a king has been reburied with enough gilding that you could go in and take again, if you go through the ritual process again. And it seems that they did. Then they took the coffin of second Enray out, they opened up the piece, they sawed through that mortise and tenon, they recommodified whatever was on the inside, and they sunk a new mortise and tenon on the piece. And you can see this. It's like looking at an archaeological stratigraphy, but it takes a careful and close eye. But it is clear that this piece has been heavily modified. Now, moving along to the coffin that was made originally for Thutmose I, but was reused for High Priest of Amen and sometimes King, Penedjem I. So we have an 18th dynasty piece reused in the early to mid 21st dynasty. And this is not amazing new material. This has been seen before, but you get an idea that we have an inlaid striped Osirian headdress for Thutmose I. This was plastered over, and the same stripes, almost in the same places, were then added for Penedjem I. He almost certainly recommodified the gold when he did that, right? Why otherwise would you not use the same surface of the coffin? You're taking the gilding that was there on the coffin of Thutmose I, and then you are resurfacing it because it is clear that you've recommodified it. And if you look closely at the neck, I argue that you can see two different layers of chiseling with a plaster layer in between. Again, this is the kind of thing that somebody who works with conservators, stratigraphy, and digital microscopy is going to have a field day with if they're able to look at imagery like this or look at the piece in person themselves and do more work. There's much more that I can say about this piece. I'm going to try to keep it to the basics. It looks like the chiseling of the gold of the hands went a bit too deep, and they had to repair them. So Thutmose I's agents, Penedjem I's agents, or maybe even pre-Penedjem, they went a little too harsh with the chisel, getting all of the gold off of the hands. And then Penedjem I is like, you know what, I want, or the people who are burying him are like, I want to use this coffin. And to use this coffin for Penedjem I, they had to repair them. So we have little blocks added in to repair the hands, and then this is re-gilded. It's gilded for Penedjem I. That gilding has all since been removed in the early 22nd dynasty when it was cached. So you have a number of commodification events happening over time. And just like in archaeological stratigraphy, you have to look at the stratigraphy of the coffin to understand how this is working. The name of Thutmose I is visible. That's not where there is visible in a cartouche underneath the plaster, which is very interesting. And you can see that Thutmose I was almost certainly interested in his inner circle, knowing that he had chosen, or his agents had chosen, the coffin of Thutmose I for this burial of Penedjem I. But he didn't want a larger audience to know that he had done this. So it's interesting to see that even in a coffin, you can see two different audiences being communicated to. One, an audience who is on the inside group, who's part of the recommodification of the materials in the Valley of the Kings, who know that this is a charged coffin of a very sacred ancestor, and they're putting their high priesthood of Amen in it to further charge his power and thereby their power. That's happening. And we also have Thutmose what was I going to say? I can't remember. Moving on. But look at this right here. You can see the old Thutmose I striping, and you see the kind of inlay that would have been there, almost certainly with a thick gold of some kind, either a gilding or maybe a sheeting. That's been removed and it's been regilded. Oh yes, I was going to say, and the second audience would only have seen this from far away and would not have known that this was a coffin of an 18th dynasty king. I think we'll leave that here. Cedar wood, you can see that it's been removed of its gold. You can see the Ujat eyes that were there on the 18th dynasty coffin before. We have dowels marked and exposed. And also, I'm showing you a lot of these images to give you an idea that in the book Recycling for Death, I am trying, if possible, to include images from every single angle of the coffin, inside, outside, foot end, head end, all of these things that we don't usually get because we're just doing the beauty shot from the front. And I'd like to propose that the Egyptians did the same. The ancient Egyptians were like, okay, we're going to take a whole lot of stuff, but we just need to really focus on the beauty shot of the front. That's going to be where everyone's looking. If we remove things from the inside, who's to know, who's to see, doesn't really matter until I open it up. And then here we go. You see mortise and tenon joints that are falling off the sides that have been sawn through, too many mortise and tenon joints. So we get an idea that this coffin, even when Penejim I was placed in it, arguably, and more work needs to be done on when this happened, has been opened and closed multiple times, that precious materials are being removed from the inside. The case seams and lid seams are being modified. Look at how the rough chiseling of gold on the case seams, and look at how they've repaired it then by adding that black varnish that goes over the edges of those modified seams. Okay, now let's move on to Thutmose III, and we'll spend most of our time here, and then I'll skip to the end because we don't have time to discuss all of these coffins in detail. And I think keeping it to 3, that'll work. So the coffin of Thutmose III is published by Darcy in 1909, I think. Is it right in front of me? No, I think it's 1909. I can't remember. Is as you see, right? You get the lid, you get the underside of the lid, and you're going to get an image of the case. This was a coffin made for a king. It has a carved Nemes headdress in the wood. You can see it's been through some stuff. It's been through some things. It has a black varnished interior. Underneath that black varnish is a white plastered background that has a very fancy 18th dynasty version of the name of Thutmose III. And so it has been assumed that inscription dates to the reign of Thutmose III. And I am here to tell you that it actually dates to the 21st dynasty, not the reign of Thutmose III. And I will show you why I think that. So these are my notes from the notability. This is not from the book. So you can see how my notes actually work and how I circle things when I'm working in the museum. And you can see that this piece has had a very thin layer of gilding that you can see on the neck. You can see it around the eyes that has since been roughly chiseled away. And according to the grave excavations in Theban tomb 320, they found fragments of Thutmose III's coffin and this rough chiseling. So it seems that this final rough chiseling that just sheared off the nose, sheared off parts of the face, happened when it was put into the cache, Theban tomb 320 or Dir al-Bahri 320 in the early 22nd dynasty. So we have that final rough scraping. But this gilding was almost certainly added in the 21st dynasty at some point after a thicker, maybe gold sheeting or something else was removed from the coffin. We see these little holes that I've circled that indicate that there was a crook and flail attached to this coffin that has since been removed, probably because it was gilded. I don't think it was solid gold or anything like that. I think that was long gone in the 20th dynasty. I think this is a 21st dynasty modification. The coffin of Thutmose III was buried, taken out and recommodified, buried, taken out and recommodified, and then buried again, which indicates that this personage, this royal ancestor, was, I argue, very important for the high priesthood of Amen. He is an ancestor, a royal divine ancestor par excellence, somebody to whom they wanted to attach their own regime. This is a regime of priest warriors, men like Payank, Harihor, Penejim, who came into their position as priest through their warrior abilities. They started as generals and then they moved into that high priesthood position. What better man to pick than Thutmose III? What better coffin to be reburied in than the coffin of Thutmose I, who went to Shirukhan and drove Hyksos out of Egypt, according to the text that we read, things like that. You see the gold that's remaining. You see that this is a cedar piece. You see that the eyes have maybe been re-inlaid with glass and that there was potentially something there before. That's an arguable point. This is a really fun point. Look at the uraeus. We used to have a double uraeus. Think of the mask of Tutankhamun with the vulture and cobra uraeus, two of them on the forehead. And here you have one of those holes plastered over. Nick Brown and I have talked about this a lot. For whatever reason, and you have to look to Nick Brown's publication for this coffin as well, but for whatever reason, by the 21st dynasty, it became much more fashionable or appropriate or acceptable to show the king with a single uraeus, not with the vulture and cobra. And we see it here on the coffin reused for Thutmose III, and we see it also on the coffin that is reused for the reburial of Ramses II, that double uraei are modified and made into single uraei, even if they're off center. So we have here, it's plastered over one hole, but the other hole still remains, and it's an off center hole. I saw somebody miss something. You're going to have to wait for the Q&A. Okay, here. Now, here you have an idea of how much this coffin was opened and closed. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So you see 3 layers of mortise and tenon joints. You see the bottommost one, when the coffin seam width, the coffin side width was probably double what it is today, what it is now. And because that was the center of that coffin side, and it is now hanging off the side. In short, they opened it up when that was the mortise and tenon joint on the center of that coffin side. And they recommodified so much gold or other material from the inside of this coffin that they had to then move to this mortise and tenon joint and sink it into the new center of the coffin side. And then they close it, and then there's a cultural memory. A generation or 2 goes by. They're like, we left a lot of good stuff in there, because they regilded it. They regilded to show that they're good caretakers. And then they come in and they remove that. And now they have to sink a new mortise and tenon. And this is now the new center of the case side. If you look at the case sides or the lid sides of Tutankhamun, you see that they're like 3 times the width of the coffin of Thutmose III, which has these skinny case and lid sides. They would have been much more substantial, made of cedar wood. But each time the Egyptians are recommodifying them and moving that mortise and tenon joint, they're making this thing thinner and thinner and thinner, which means, in short, that this inscription, even though it says Menheperre, seems to have been written in a way that is typical of the 18th dynasty with this weird cross-hatching that you also see on the interior of Yuya and Tuya. Nick Brown pointed that out to me. When you see this, you think, oh, it's definitely 18th dynasty. It's not. It's 21st dynasty. It has to be, because otherwise these mortise and tenon joints would not be moving and hanging off the edge of the coffin. It's the same with the coffin of Ramses II that's demonstrated in the book. And you get an idea that they're ritually healing the piece again by adding this black varnish. So they coat with a white plaster. They put the name of the king Thutmose III there, but then as a way of healing it like a Band-Aid, if you like, they're putting this black varnish on. It's like, oh, no harm, no foul. Now you're okay. Now you're Osiris. Now you are of this blackness that is the only one that gives off light. And I published on this black varnish in that regard in an article I did for, I think it's called Tomb Murals, and it's an Oriental Institute volume that Betsy Bryan and Peter Dorman edited. Black varnish is really interesting stuff. Look at the ledges, or I used to call them ledges. I call them seams. I had to come up with terminology on the fly. But these coffin seams have been cut through very roughly, and there are remnants of gilding. Yeah, there we go. Right here in the corner, there are remnants of gilding on these seams. So you understand why they're going after these coffin case and lid seams so roughly, to remove that probably second or third iteration of regilding each time with thinner gilding. And then they put it in there, finally the one last removal, and then they just cut through it very, very roughly. So the coffin of Ramses II, we really don't have time to look at with any kind of careful eye. I would alert you to Nicholas Reeves' article in the Vatican Coffin Conference. And he suggests that this coffin once belonged to Horemheb, and I think he's right. It could belong to Ai, but it's an arguable point. Note the modification of the uraeus. I think I have a closer image of that coming up. This is a cedar piece. Yeah, here's the closer image of that uraeus. And you get an idea that this used to be 2 holes, and it has been modified to have a wooden uraeus as a replacement for golden pieces. Crook and flail almost certainly used to be golden pieces. These have been replaced with wooden pieces. Ramses II was obviously a very esteemed, respected member of the divine ancestors, and was treated as such with a reburial in this coffin that was not made for him, but was made for a king. You have the dockets. We've done some de-stretch to get a better understanding of the images that are written underneath, because you can see that there's text underneath. Other people have worked on this, and other people can continue to work on it. It's pretty complicated stuff. Okay, one last thing I want to point out here. Okay, note this. That is a hanging mortise and tenon. It's a hanging mortise, right? The tenon's gone, but it's a hanging mortise and tenon join that was once in the center of the side of the lid that has been thinned down because of the removal, I would argue, of sorry about my screen, it'll come back, there we go, of an inlaid sheet gold, I think I would argue. Could be an inlaid gilding, but when you have an inlay that goes deep into the wood surface or into a plaster surface, and you remove that gilded inlay matrix, you're going to remove a tremendous amount of the wood as well. And that does seem to be what's happened on the exterior of this coffin in which Ramses II was reburied. And that hanging mortise and tenon is right there. You can see it pretty clearly. Lots of modification on this piece, interior, exterior. Another thing that's really interesting to note is how when they do something to a piece, they can add that black varnish, or they can add red paint. And the red paint, and this is Carrie Arbuckle McLeod's work, that red paint can heal an edge. It can create a fiery wall of protection, a super force field, if you like. Anders Bettum also worked on those red edges. There, get an idea of the thickness of the sides of Tutankhamun, and get an idea of how they're stepped. They're ledged sides. They're not just a flat seam. They have a step so that the lid and the case can fit like a box into that step. And it would be wonderful once these pieces are on display, and maybe it's funny how the more famous the piece is, the less studied it is once it goes into the museum, but to get some sort of a measurement of that side of the coffin lid and coffin case, and then to compare it to the coffin in which Ramses II was reburied, Penedjem I, Tutmos III, and get an understanding how much thickness was removed, how much gilding, how much inlay, what's going on here. There's so much more work that needs to be done in comparison to the little that we have remaining in terms of gilded coffin wood. Tutankhamun is the only thing. The Tanis coffins did not survive. Only the pure metal coffins survived from that tomb. Okay, we're skipping you, sweet boy. We're skipping this one. I'm going to go right to my last slide. Everyone look away if this makes you sick. We'll go to this one. These are and I should add Ramses IX here. Sorry. And I don't have a little caption for the image. This is an incomplete slide. I do apologize. Ramses IX should be added here. And I argue that these divine ancestors, royal divine ancestors, they are divinized when they're recoffined and put into the tomb with the high priest of Amun, the family of Penedjem I, and cached in the 22nd dynasty, that these are the preferred personages with which that regime associated themselves. And they did not want to associate themselves with the 20th dynasty kings, except maybe for Ramses IX, and that's it. And that image of Ramses IX with high priest of Amun, Amenhotep, maybe gives us an idea why Ramses IX was given this special privilege. And the fact that it's remembered hundreds of years later when these things are cached in Dynasty 22, I find pretty stunning. Here's an image of one of these high priest coffins, Masaharta, to give you the quick reminder that these are also reused. They've suffered theft of gilded faces and hands. You can see multiple layers of decoration, including black varnish underneath, white plastered layers, which suggests to me that this was originally an 18th dynasty coffin. More work needs to be done to prove it. You can look at the case sides, lid sides of this and see that they're not even and that these were cut down. I would argue from an 18th dynasty coffin, but again, more work needs to be done. You see multiple layers of plaster, decorative layers. Look at how many decorative layers you have, these plaster layers, at least 3, maybe 4 on the coffin of Mat Ka-Ra, whose outer coffin is on the cover of the book. Yeah, we're skipping you. This reuse and recommodification was such a problem, but that by the 22nd dynasty, important personages, when they were buried, it seems wanted a defensive solution. And so there is this first instance of painting on a thick black bitumen resinous substance all over the inside and outside of these coffins, such that even if you wanted to take the gold, it would be so embedded in this black varnish matrix that it would be useless to you. You wouldn't be able to recommodify it, even if you wanted. And that does seem to be what we have on the coffin set of Nesit-Ta-Nebet Ishiru. And if you want to learn more about this, I published an article in John Taylor's Festschrift, which has just come out about this application of black varnish, how it was done, why it was done. And now we come to the slide at the end. And that was a good hour. That's fine. And you guys can ask me all the questions that you want. These are my books at the top, the books that are the most easily accessible to you. If you want to hear me rant and ramble about anything Egyptian, you should go to my podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, and listen to Afterlives of Ancient Egypt. I do that with Jordan Galzinski and Amber Myers-Wells. Yeah. Oh, and go to Substack. That's the other new thing that we've done. And we're starting much more content on Substack. And I'm trying to convince Nicholas Brown to be a part of that as well. So we'll have more content coming out for all of you on all of these different platforms. But with that, thank you very much. And I will take your questions. Okay, so I'm running the questions, right? No one else is running the questions? Yeah. Okay, let's see. Oh, look, somebody who took Women in Power. That's great, in 21. So cool. Hi. Nice to have you here. Okay, Edith, let's see. Ramses IX appears to be standing on a plinth, which would make him smaller than the high priest and the statue. It's an interesting thing to think about, and that image art historically has been worked on. I think more work could be done. And the other thing about the high priest of Amenhotep, he's there standing with his arms up in that Karnak image, and he's got little high priests who are dressing him down below, which makes him the focal point of the scene. It's obvious it's about him. It is not about Ramses IX. Ramses IX is very much a supporting character in that image, so I completely agree, Edith. Okay, Barbara, do we map our own abhorrence of disturbing the dead onto ancient Egyptian reuse? How sacrilegious would it actually have been? This is a really difficult question, Barbara. It's something that I think the Egyptians were also anxious about. They had an anxiety about this amount of reuse. And I talk about that anxiety in the book Recycling for Death and how they dealt with it, because they're disturbing the kings, these royal ancestors, and they're not just disturbing them once. The coffins document that they're disturbing them 2, 3, 4 times and opening them back up and saying, I got to take a little bit more. No, I got to take a little bit more. And one last time. And then, oh, you have nothing left to give me. I'm going to put you away in the cache. It's kind of like that book I hated as a child, The Giving Tree. Do you know it? By Shel Silverstein. Where by the end, the tree is like, yes, he's like the poor tree. She's given him everything. I feel like that. My kid came into the room, right? This motherhood thing. But anyway, the tree gives him everything. And then finally, when there's nothing left to give, like a little stump, then the boy just sits on the tree stump at the end of this book. But it reminds me of these coffins and how the ancestors are asked to give to the Egyptian regime to maintain it, at least in the Theban Upper Egyptian space, until they can't give anymore. And then it doesn't seem that anybody wants to hang out with them anymore. They're put away. They're unpopular. And when the high priesthood of Amen is taken over by force by the 22nd dynasty, and there is an elite replacement with the 22nd dynasty family member, then you see them put away completely. There's very little interest in working with these ancestor kings in the way that they had been previously. But the sacrilegiousness of it, I think every Egyptian elite would have felt. And you do have texts like Khonsu Emhab and the Ghost, where this elite is being haunted by an old high priest who's like, I'm going to haunt you and I'm going to haunt you. And then the man who's being haunted realizes he needs to give him back his coffin set, and he re-coffins him in some way. And then the haunting stops. So there is an understanding of anxiety, but in the same way that the Egyptians would bury some people with a pot made of granite and then bury other people with a pot that was made of limestone but painted to look like granite. That's kind of, they already have those tools. So they can say, I'm going to take your golden coffin from you, but I'm going to give you back a yellow painted wooden coffin that should serve you in terms of its ritual purpose. And thereby, I recoffin you, I reosirify you, you should be at peace. So it does seem that there's a give and take in this relationship. And I talk about this, like the debts that the dead owe to the living regime, because they are considerable debts, it seems. And it seems that the living has no trouble taking from the regime of the dead to support the regime of the living, which is interesting. Oh, Deanne, I know you got to see Julian. That's sweet. Okay. Atina, is there evidence of a similar care to replicate whatever was removed? Or is this only for the royal gilt reuse coffins? I do not think that people whose coffins have been recycled are getting the same treatment that Seti I or Ramses II were getting. For example, if you look at the tomb of look at the Deir el-Medina tomb of Senedjem and Khonsu, Theban tomb 1, got the number 1 when they were numbering them. You see that out of the 22 bodies, only 9 individuals were found when that tomb was found. They thought intact, but I would argue it's a 20th dynasty version of intact. Only 9 were found in coffin sets or single coffins, and the rest were in mummiform form, maybe wrapped in a palm rib mat or something, but over to the side in the tomb without a coffin. And I think that's what most people got. They got some sort of a container, like a palm rib matting or something, and a whole lot of magic, a whole lot of ritual to make those dead less angry. But again, we don't have evidence. If I don't have a material thing to archaeologically examine, I can't tell you, if the rituals were over the top in some way when they're doing this kind of reuse, or if they just go in and do something really rough and ready. So it's not really clear. Now, as for the coffins that I've shown you, I think you can see that what was removed was of much greater value and of much greater craft value. So material value and craft value. Then they remove that. And what they put back is of lesser material value and indeed lesser craft value. And you can see it with your own eyes. You can see that they're roughly smacking on some plaster over something that's been chiseled, and it doesn't really matter that much. Think of the coffin of Second Enrei Tao and the rough surface of it. That's very common. Or adding that black varnish very roughly so that it just kind of scrapes over the sides that have been modified. That lack of craftsmanship care is common on these pieces, which suggests they're not displayed after, or at least closely seen in a display. The interior certainly wasn't, as maybe it would have been for a burial of Tutankhamun or a burial of Ramses II. And I think more work needs to be done on those kinds of things. What were the focal points in the reburials? I'm not sure if I'm going to do that work. We'll see. We'll see. Jongmin, hi, how you doing? Maybe I missed something, but ancient Egyptians must have known the malevolence of ancestral spirits. How did they justify or rationalize or explain the recommodification and reuse of the coffin? Is even this phenomenon of reosirification, can it be interpreted as some kind of pacifying or revering of the ancestors? This is the question, this is the $1 million question, right? We're asked this every time. And my way of answering this question with normal reuse, right? Or maybe the reuse for Penegem the First, is that if an ancestor has already been Osirified, maybe an ancestor of the 19th dynasty or early 20th dynasty has been Osirified, and you've just lost a precious family member just recently, and you need to Osirify them, and you haven't done it, and your beliefs demand that you need material, a material container, a coffin, a nested set of coffins to do that, then you will pull that material from the ancestors who have already been thus transformed. And in many ways, you can see it as the only moral solution for an elite person who believes they need material to properly Osirify or divinize their recently deceased dead. So it's a question of how you have to take from the long dead to give to the recently dead. And it is a moral quandary. It's a little bit like the trolley car thing where, 5 people are over there tied on the tracks and then the whole car, and do you kill the 5 people or the one, that kind of thing. The Egyptian elites are almost certainly having that arithmetic in their head and thinking, I don't even remember great Aunt Bertha or whoever it is. And if I don't remember her and she's already moved into the afterlife and she's already been Osirified and divinized and all of that, then I think it's probably morally okay because my mother or my father has just died and I need to Osirify them now. And I need to show that our family has the power to do this. In many ways, it's the only moral solution in a time period of great scarcity. And people are crafty, people are creative, and people adapt, and they adapt with the means at their disposal, even when they don't have everything available. What I find so interesting is that when everything's going to hell in a handbasket and the society is falling apart around people's ears, they still don't give up the funeral, the material wealth display. They don't give it up. It changes, becomes more defensive. It becomes less ostentatious. It becomes more hidden. But they don't give it up. And that right there tells you a lot about human elites in patriarchal society. I've written about that in other places, so we'll keep that here. Let's see, Claudius Reich says, did the reuse and rescraping hit a point of diminishing returns? Yes, it did. Any indications of how burial practices were affected? Did they start to simplify? Or did fewer elites get proper burials? Yeah, so we kind of touched on it a little when we got to that Nesit Nebet Ishiru coffin, where you see that in the 22nd dynasty, Theban elites are like, they're showing these beautiful gilded coffins, mostly inner pieces that are gilded, and then the outer pieces, they're not covering with gold in the same way. And then they pour a whole load of that black bitumen on it. And you can see an example of that in the British Museum. Many museums have such examples of that. So it's a defensive strategy to make that gold uncommodifiable. It's also a strategy, I argue in the book, that knows that the necropolis workers themselves are the ones most susceptible to take from the tomb. And this is why I think they're using so much of this black substance, and why they're also using cartonnage. Cartonnage is a wonderful wood replacement, right? It's like you can make your own wood. You use linen, you use papyrus, you use plaster, and you can make your own coffin wood in a sense. And so that's a defensive strategy, especially when you lace it up the back of the mummy, and then you gild it. And if somebody can't reuse that coffin without cracking open and breaking the cartonnage. So it's a very defensive strategy to use cartonnage in and of itself. It's also defensive then if you gild it to then cover it with that black resinous material. One of the coolest adaptations, and I talk about a lot of these defensive adaptations in a 2011 article that I wrote for the Journal of the American Research Center in Egypt, otherwise known as JRC. One of the coolest adaptations is burial in a temple space. Burial by a professionalized necropolis community that's in a walled temple space. So you see places like Ramses II's Temple of Millions of Years, what we call the Ramesseum, being modified and transformed into an elite burial ground in the Third Intermediate Period. The walls will protect it. The priests who work there and live there are, as necropolis workers, making sure those those elites are contained and that their material won't be stolen. So that's a wonderful defensive strategy. And look at the royal burials, the 22nd dynasty, 21st and 22nd dynasty royal burials in the tomb complex at Tanis. That's another instance of defensive strategy. Bury them in the temple. Put them in the temple where you've got gateways and guards and other treasures to protect. And it seems it worked, right? We do have those coffins, or the gold and silver coffins preserved to us. The ground itself ate alive the wooden pieces. So that's too bad. But it did work in terms of a defensive strategy. Elisabetta says, thank you for your presentation. And is the age of the cedar trees used for coffins recorded by any study? What was the age of the tree used for Ramses II's coffin? Oh, would that we could do C14 dating on all of this wood, Elisabetta. That would be great. We can't take samples out of Egypt. The only C14 that particle accelerator that exists, I don't think it's a particle accelerator, I don't know what you would call it. I'm not a C14 specialist, as you can tell, but it's in the IFAO labs in Cairo. And it's not going to give you a very great range. It's going to give a very large range for your C14. A cedar tree is also going to have a very long life, and its date is going to depend on where you pull from the tree. So you would want to get multiple samples to be able to account for that. But yeah, cedar tree age, wood age in general, I have sent many things off. When it's a coffin that's in Europe or in the United States, I have sent samples off to the University of California, Irvine particle accelerator, and I've gotten some good dates back, and dates from multiple parts of the coffin that show that these coffins are made of a variety of woods from a variety of different places. So I dated a couple of 22nd dynasty coffins that showed wood that was as late as 9th century, 800 BCE. So 22nd dynasty, it's cut down from trees in the moment, native sycamore fig. And then wood that was very old, going all the way back to 15th century BC. So arguably 18th dynasty, or 18th dynasty wood. So you have carpenters working with what they have. And I think a lot more C14 study would be very interesting. I know that some people are working on things like that, but a more systematic C14 study would be great. And a systematic C14 study of all of the wooden coffins in which royalty were reburied would be even better. So yeah. And then cedar for coffins, I think I would look at Carrie Arbuckle McLeod's work for woodworking, wood type, species identification. She's really the person I work with the most on wood variety, wood crafting. So I would look at her work, and she does have a lot out there and published. Atena says, again, would you elaborate a bit on the second audience for the coffin and why you think the reuse might have been hidden, especially from a history of emotions perspective? For example, would the fear of realizing that one's coffin may be reused in the future have been more impactful than the awe from the association with prestigious ancestors? I do think that elites realize that when they themselves are ripping the hands and face off of a coffin because they need the gold or want the gold, that it's probably not a good idea to make your hands and face have gilding on it. And I think there was a defensive strategy as the 21st and 22nd dynasties went on to have faces with yellow paint rather than gilding. And I think it's why orpiment, sparkly yellow arsenic paint, became so popular in the 21st dynasty, because I think people were defensively trying to avoid gold, which is interesting. The second audience is an interesting thing. So let me explain this more carefully. Let's say you're Herihor and you're the high priest, you used to be the general, you're moving into a community that maybe trusts you, probably doesn't as a whole, but they need you. And you're working with your army and a group of high priests to pull out maybe you're working on the coffin of Thutmose III, and you're pulling out all of that treasure. We don't know what's in it. We can imagine what was in the tomb of Tutankhamun, but is it comparable? This is way earlier in the 18th dynasty. We don't know. We don't know. Look to Nick Brown's dissertation for these kinds of things. Interesting reconstructions of what we do know. But say they pull out 3 coffins of Thutmose III, and say the coffin in which Thutmose III was reburied was originally one of his coffins. We actually can't know. It could have been Amenhotep II's coffin originally. We don't know. Let's say the innermost coffin that Thutmose III was buried in was made of solid gold. And like Tutankhamun's, right? Inlay embedded into gold, a golden solid gold matrix. That they pull out the inlay, they're going to melt it down. No one's going to talk about it. There's nothing to see. It's gone. The piece is gone. This is why I think all of the coffins that were made for kings are 18th dynasty, because I think the coffins that were made for 19th and 20th dynasty kings were made of solid gold, and they're just simply gone. I can't prove it, but I can say it here and say that I think it, given what's preserved and what's left as 18th dynasty examples. Now, say you pull out the 2 outer pieces, and they're made of gilded wood or wood with sheet gold on them. And everyone sees you pull out these coffins. And by everyone, I mean the warriors who are a part of your military community of practice, and the priests who are there to make sure that Thutmose III's spirit doesn't get like totally vengeful and really angry. And they're helping to make sure everything is done ritually correctly. Now, you bring that to a workshop and you remove the gold sheeting. Let's say there's gold sheeting on the outer coffin and it's really nice. You remove that gold sheeting and you do so in a community of fewer people. You don't want that much attention. You don't want people to know how much you're taking. Then when you display it again and you say, we are caretakers of Thutmose III, we are recoffining him, he is important to us, we care, only we can fix it, or whatever. You're going to regild it, but you're not going to show the comparison of how much gold you've removed. So you have a small audience on the inside with the people at the top of society and the craftsmen who are removing that gold. They put that into a treasury. Only very few people know about it. You then show the regilded pieces. Maybe when they reburied Thutmose III, he had 2 pieces with him. It's quite possible, instead of the single piece that we found in Dir al-Bahri 320. And when you show it, you're like, look, there's still gold there. We didn't take everything. We're not animals or whatever they're trying to communicate. And that's what I mean by a second audience. There are multiple audiences at work here. And there's very few people, I would argue, who know all exactly how the sausage is being made, if I may use this analogy for this coffin recycling. And I hope that answered your question. Trent Hugler. Hey, how you doing, Trent? Thanks heaps. That's great. I hope you didn't stay up too far past your bedtime. Okay, my question is, considering the early dates of dockets recording the renewal of burials in the 21st dynasty under the high priest Penegem, was Theban tomb 320 in use from this period with burials continually added over time, or did it only receive these burials in a single mass event in the early 22nd dynasty? You have just touched on a third rail of these discussions. And Rogerio Souza, and in his work on caches, particularly the Bab el-Ghazou's cache, but also the Dir al-Bahri cache, it coincides with David Aston's understanding of the cache. So Rogerio Souza believes in a gradual filling in of the cache. David Aston is more of the mindset that there were moments that things were put in to the cache, and he dates those moments. This is really complicated, and so I would encourage you to read David Aston's article in the Bab el-Ghazou's volume that I edited with Alessia Menta and Rogerio Souza. It's brilliant, and it really lays out what a cache is, how it's a final moment, how it's not a gradual filling in of a tomb. It's like a putting away of things, and when they put things away and how, and he ties it to certain political moments. So it's super complicated, and yes, you have to use all of these dockets. And given that, I would also look to Nick Reeves's work, The Decline of the Valley of the Kings, which is irreplaceable. I mean, it's super helpful for all of this material. And I think he would see it as a kind of both, like that you're reusing this queen's tomb, In the same way that Naouni was a 21st dynasty individual found in Merit Amun's tomb, a reused 18th dynasty tomb. If you're familiar with the Met coffins, right? Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Here we have Deir el-Bahri 320 or Theban tomb 320, which may have been Ahmose Nefertari's tomb or another queen's tomb. And then it's being reused. And Graefe would argue that it was Ahmose Nefertari's tomb. I think I have that right. I hope I don't have that messed up. So it's complicated, and you'll need to do more research, Trent, to figure out what's going on. Teresa, hi. It has been suggested that the wall with the image of Amenhotep before Ramses IX or his statue was actually on the rear interior wall of the high priest's quarters. If true, this would affect the significance of the relief, wouldn't it? Sorry, I haven't got a citation at hand. Send me the citation when you find it. I would love to know that. Yes. And who was the audience that got to see this in the 21st dynasty, I think, or at the end of the 20th, is important. And I do think that knowing what we know of Karnak Temple at the end of the New Kingdom and going into the 21st dynasty, knowing what we know of the genealogy, knowing what we know of the inside players and how many there were, I have argued elsewhere that this is very much a closed community, a closed temple community. And it's a repository of wealth simultaneously. So really, they've circled the wagons, to use an old American West expression, to keep this space safe, starting in the mid-20th dynasty. And Medinet Habu is a similar case in point on the West Bank. You have these fortified temple structures that have institutions that work well. These institutions survive the collapse, right? And they're actually able to continue running things in Thebes without people going into mass starvation, with some semblance of elite replacement, but not everybody. And they're able to do so because the institution of the temple was able to step in and fill the vacuum of power created by the loss of a vizier, the loss of a strong king, the loss of the king's men, and all of these things. So whether it's part of the priestly quarters or not, I would argue that it's for a very small audience. Either way, I don't think we're going to have grand processions where everyone's allowed in this north-south corridor. This is the time of the Decade Festival, arguably even now, though we don't have that documented in written form until Penegem I, from his inscription at Medinet Habu, first instance of that festival happening every 10 days to bring the gods back and forth every 10 days. It seems it's a more intimate space, a more busy space, and a more protected space. So I agree with you that it's not there for everyone to see. Hi, let's see, Brooke from IU Egyptology. Hey there. You mentioned that you suspect state-sanctioned reuse earlier than the reign of Ramses VI. Yes, I did mention that. In that case, what is the earliest evidence you've come across for reuse orchestrated by the highest echelon of Egyptian society? Thank you, Brooke. So again, I can't prove it for king's tombs, but I see reuse starting in the 20th dynasty. The book that I wrote, The Cost of Death, and I looked at those 19th dynasty coffins very carefully from a craft perspective. And I've re-looked at the coffins in the Met and at Cairo from that same craft perspective, looking for reuse. And I don't see reuse in those 19th dynasty coffins. I do see reuse in the 20th dynasty coffins. And there's a coffin in Toronto, and I can't remember whose name it is, a 20th dynasty piece, and it has the date of, I believe, Seti the First. Sorry, not Seti the First, Ramses the Third, associated on that coffin in Toronto. I don't think the king's name is there, but for some reason, like a priestly title or something, I can't remember. It's early 20th dynasty, and there's reuse there. It's a gender reuse, shifting a coffin from female to male, if I remember properly. But you do see reuse as early as Ramses the Third, if not before. So high elites are doing it. High elites are going into their family sepulchres to reuse. Otherwise, they don't have the wood that they need. And I would suggest that important Theban personages are all also doing it. Can I prove it? No. Is it happening on the sly? Oh my goodness, certainly. And were they using Deir el-Medina workers to help them? Almost certainly. Are the Deir el-Medina workers going to write it down? No. No one's going to write this down. And only until we get the tomb robbery, when we get the tomb robbery papyri in Ramses VI, and they're like, what is going on here? Who would allow gambling in this establishment, to quote Casablanca, the movie with Humphrey Bogart, where you're asking an obvious question that you know the answer to, but it makes sense that systematic tomb recycling in the highest echelons of society and the best necropolises would have started before they were recording things about tomb robbery in the reign of Ramses VI. I know this makes people's heads explode and upsets them, but I'm going to stand by it. And given the amount that's recorded in Deir el-Medina about the royal ancestors and how well they knew the different kings and how they revered them and how they were caretaking for the kings and the queens, it's interesting. I do understand that there is a royal cult for Amenhotep I and his mother Ahmaz Nefertari that goes back to the 19th dynasty. And I am not going to try to claim that systematic recycling goes back to the 19th dynasty. But I do think that the 20th dynasty, Ramses III, is not a crazy date given the amount of mercenaries, or if people don't like the word mercenary, I know this is not a word that many people like to use now, paid soldiers are going to need money. And if you're fighting off sea peoples and you are maybe paying sea peoples who have settled to help you fight sea peoples who are coming in now, you're going to need ready sources of cash. And one of the best ways to get those is from the Valley of the Kings. So I think just circumstantially a date of Ramses III would be great. I don't think we're ever going to be able to prove it, though. I don't think we can, unless some crazy text comes out like Stefan Polis's, where he's like, I pray that you may help me find gold today. And that's a 21st dynasty text, so that's not surprising. But for anything in the 20th, it's going to be problematic. But I've got a lot of documented coffin reuse from the 20th, a lot. So thanks for that question, Brooke. That's great. Let's see. D. Olson reminds me of animal mummies that contain no actual animals. Yep. People do all kinds of things to show what they want to show, and have the focal point where people's attention is going, give the story that they need the audience to have. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what's on the inside of a piece is what the outside is representative of. Arthur, thanks for the YouTube, but I'm not going to watch it right now. Chris Bell, I have enjoyed listening in. Oh, parenting. Yeah, we all got to do that. Bye, Chris. Jongmin, you're welcome. Let's see. Final note. Okay, here we go. We're getting to the end here. If you would like to order Kara's book, contacting AUC Press directly is the best bet. The edition is indeed almost sold out, so get to it. If you're in Europe, go to AUC Press in New York and pray, because I don't know if you're going to be able to get it. And again, even though people don't like to pay 80, 90 bucks for an edition that's digital, the pictures are such high quality. You're going to be able to zoom in and do more with the digital than you can with the paper. So, well, I can only say that so many times, that digital version is amazing. It's amazing, but I know people don't want to pay for PDFs. They just want to find it. They want to get one. So buy it together with a bunch of friends. I'm not going to tell. Go ahead and do that. Get like 10 people together and buy a digital version and give it to each other.
And have a watch party and have a fantastic watch party.
I say you should do that. I dare say $10 for a really nice PDF is not a stupid thing to do.
That actually is a good idea.
Isn't it? Here I am telling you how to do that. It's like I've learned from the coffin recyclers myself how to do these things. Glenn, do you have any evidence of coffin reuse that wasn't driven by need for resources? I mean, how would I know? But yes, I think we do. I think that the coffin for Penegem I is a nice one, right? Penegem I could have used any coffin. He could have used, he could have broken down the wood and had a coffin rebuilt, but he used the coffin of Thutmose I and plastered over the striping and then put new striping in the same place, plastered over the pectoral and the chest, then put a new pectoral in the same place. That right there suggests to me that he and his craftsmen and his inner circle of high priests knew that they wanted the coffin of Thutmose I for ideological reasons. It's not just material. There's another really good example, which would be Naomi reusing the coffin of her mother, Tabechnet. And the name of her mother, Tabechnet, is retained on the case sides. It is not erased. And there are other coffins that show older ancestors' names who used to be in that coffin, and it's reused, retained on the coffin, which I would say is like finding your loved ones in the afterlife, in a sense, and connecting yourself with them through that physical mechanism. So I would argue there's some family reuse that has an ideological purpose as well. And then Teresa tells me there's some evidence for veneration of Amenhotep I and Ahmose Nefertari from the mid-18th dynasty, though the bulk of the evidence is Ramessid. Theban tomb 181, 161, a number of stelae. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's when I start to see the lineup of ancestors in 20th dynasty kings, like in Hirhau, when I start to go, something might be going on here. And I just did a paper that will be published in a volume that Alize de Villiers is working on. She has a postdoc at Leiden University right now. And I use the tomb of Ki Nebu, published by Thomas Bach. And there's a really interesting image that shows different versions of Amen. Amen of the treasury, Amen of the Valley of the Kings, Amen of this, Amen of that. And I argue that this is a way for Ki Nebu, as an insider on tomb recycling in the late 20th dynasty, to show in a coded way his ability to be connected to the recycling that's happening and the strongholds of power who are keeping those treasures safe. It's a circumstantial argument, but it's one based on a 20th dynasty tomb and the kinds of things that they're displaying, but in a kind of code, because there's your two audiences again. You have an audience that you're like, everything's fine, I'm not taking a whole bunch of gold from under your nose. And then the audience is on the inside doing it with you. And you know that they know that you know. And then, it's like the if you know thing. That's kind of the first audience. So thank you all. I'll leave it there.